probably the main factor which drives the increasing interest in the application of neurosciences in the field of media and marketing research is the recognition that what people say bears in many cases little resemblance to the actual processes that influence behaviour and motivation. And this has been recognised really for a long time, really more by the creatives, for example, rather than the market researchers, who have tended to use the more traditional techniques of asking questions, essentially techniques that rely on what I'd call symbolic communication. Making marks on a piece of paper, even twiddling a dial is a form of symbolic communication, because you're asking yourself, now, how far do I turn this dial? As a cognitive neuroscience researcher, I was particularly interested in developing new technology to understand the activity of the brain, particularly during normal thinking processes. My main research area was looking at memory and attention, and also disorders in memory and attention in conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and also schizophrenia. And as such, we developed a technology which we call steady state topography, which uses the brain's electrical activity, or EEG, but actually measures something quite different to what normally EEG measures. What we do is actually measure the speed of activity in different parts of the brain. Now you might say, well, so what? What does the speed tell you? Well, the speed is related to the activity of that part of the brain. And we know that different parts of the brain specialise for different functions. So if you know what is the activity in different parts of the brain, you can infer what is the psychological state. So we can measure whether, for example, what type of attention you're paying to a situation, whether the left hemisphere is more active, so you're paying attention to more detail, right hemisphere, the global features, facial expression, but we can also measure very relevant parameters, such as what is actually going into long-term memory. And by that I mean memory that can last years, decades, etc. But clearly, any sort of communication that's meant to have an effect on future attitude and behaviour, such as advertising, has to go into long-term memory. And we can actually measure on a second-by-second basis what is going into that. And what we've found is that particularly what goes into memory around the time of certain key message and branding is strongly correlated with the effectiveness of commercial communication. And the other issue is that we can also measure how relevant the material is. And there's a certain region of the brain which becomes active when you observe things that are of personal relevance to you. And we use the term engagement. I must admit, we've had second and third thoughts about whether we use the term engagement. We know what we mean by it in terms of the neuroscience, but the term has been used in so many different ways that really sometimes I think it adds more confusion. But the point is that we can actually measure engagement on a second-by-second basis, and that's of enormous relevance in the area of media.
What we've managed to share with the ARF delegates this time is how this database of neuro respondents, which now adds up to more than 400 respondents in just the radio case study alone, has allowed the client to use very granular time series data of engagement and memory to analyse key triggers of engagement. And what's turned out to be really interesting is how the brand integration in program content can actually be optimised by understanding these key triggers at a very granular level, key triggers that drive engagement up and keep the audience sticky, and the reverse, actually key triggers that lose an audience. And of course you don't want to lose an audience at the most important times, and some of those times are when the sponsors are being integrated into content. So really that raises the notion of an ecosystem, understanding that what works for the consumer or the listener or the viewer works for advertiser and also works for broadcaster or radio program content producer. And if that ecosystem is respected, it works for all stakeholders. If it's not respected, it falls apart. It's pretty simple. So they're the learnings, and then those learnings which are granular at one level can be aggregated into a database to look at the effect of, say, position in brake and the flow of momentum of engagement from program into ad break. And what we're seeing here is that the program context has a huge influence over how the ads are processed. And one of those influences is simply the flow of engagement from program into ad break, to the point where we can look at position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and model out the actual incremental benefit of an ad first in break versus 3, 4, 5. And because the database is big enough now, it's given us the ability to say the premium, the incremental influence that a program has on an ad first in break is 64% greater than that of a position 3 to 6, which has been the perpetual debate in TV and radio and any linear broadcast media. How much is it worth? What is the incremental benefit over the power of my ad, in terms of effectiveness? And that's important because all this culminates around engagement driving memory encoding, that very important measure that Richard spoke about as well. And memory encoding is the measure that's been linked to advertising effectiveness and consumer behaviour. So we've drawn as direct a line as possible from media engagement through to advertising effectiveness.
Since about the 60s, there has been an interest in applying brain sciences to the field of marketing. And it's been my observation that about every 10 or so years, someone sort of got up and said, gee, why don't we try applying brainwaves to advertising research? And it generally didn't get anywhere. And the reasons it didn't get anywhere were multifold. One, our understanding of the brain was actually much more limited then, point one. Point two, there has been literally an explosion of technological advancement in methods of recording and analysing brain activity, and that's been my principal research activity, and hence our development of the steady state topography methodology. But what we've aimed at doing is to take this technology outside of the research lab, outside of the clinic, into the real world, into the commercial world. So we have developed equipment which enables basically groups of 10 people, we've done up to about 24 people at a time, to sit in a little theaterette, put little, what look like shower caps and little visors on, and watch a program, or interact with the internet, for example, or even interact with handheld device. And what we've been able to do is to measure those specific aspects of brain activity associated, say, with advertising. And I'll start with that. One of the most important ones is memory encoding. What actually goes into memory? We know that if, in fact, the key message, or especially the branding information, doesn't go into memory, but other parts go into memory, you have the classic case of, do you remember the ad? Oh yes, of course, that was the one with the elephant. What was the brand? What was the product? Don't know. That's when, so we know that that's crucial. We've actually published, we're one of the few, probably the only ones that have actually published findings linking brain activity while watching television to actual consumer behaviour. And we've actually got a number of case studies. And one of the things that struck us, given that we have, if you will, a metric of advertising effectiveness, we can see what influences that metric. And what we find is that it's really very sensitive. Little things that you might think are almost irrelevant can have a huge effect. Whether a shot, for example, when someone is talking about the benefits of, as an example, frozen fish, whether it's a tight shot or a long shot, can change the way that voiceover is processed. And what we've found is that little changes to an ad can make a huge effect on its effectiveness. And we've actually, we're pleased that the clients have actually shared the actual consumer behaviour side of the story with us as well. So we're actually able to take a study. The client has come to us with a particular issue. We're concerned about this particular campaign. We've analysed the data, we've looked at it, and in many cases the suggestions as to what to do pop out from the actual findings themselves. The client makes the change, and then we've actually got metrics on the consumer behaviour out there, be it sales, etc. And the classic case, one where there was some slight change to, in this case, a frozen fish commercial. its brand linkage shot up from 8 to about 54%. Huge amount. Market share increase, and yet they were really small changes. And when I actually presented this at the Cannes Advertising Festival a few years ago, I actually showed the more effective ad and the less effective ad in random order and asked the creatives which one did they think was the more effective one. It was a 50-50 guess. Of course, after we'd shown them the results, everybody knew, of course, oh, it had to be that first one. The other thing that we've seen is how small things can have a huge effect. In many cases, you'd think that they're almost so small as to be irrelevant. One study for a large pharmaceutical company were looking at the effect of music, just a rhythm section behind an advertisement, and 2 rhythm sections which I must admit to my untrained ear sounded much of a muchness. And yet they had a huge effect on the effectiveness of the ad. The slower rhythm was actually much more effective than the fast one. And this was actually borne out in terms of the actual web traffic that was actually available and returned to us, that we were able to get access to. The other issue that is really important, which Peter touched on, is how ads just don't occur in isolation. Well, maybe they do if you're doing market research and someone throws a clutter reel at you, but that's not the way people normally consume that sort of experience. Normally, an advertisement for television occurs in a context, a program. And we've been looking at how does the environment of the program influence the way the ad is processed. And what we've found is that the particular, if you will, neurostate that you are in during the program, the type of neuro-contextual matching, has a huge effect on the effectiveness of the ad, particularly if it's the first and second ad in the break. And so it can make a big difference in terms of the effectiveness. So what we're beginning to form now is a much more holistic view as to the way different sorts of advertising works, but also how internet advertising and television advertising work, the neurostates that they are in. We presented these findings just recently, last week, in London, where essentially the neurostate that you are in when you're watching, say, drama on television is quite different to the state that you're in when you are browsing the web. Different sorts of advertising will work more effectively for the different media. It's knowing how to bring them together. A neurostate is essentially a particular, if you will, relatively stable pattern of brain activity associated with that particular meeting. It could be associated with the levels of attention in combination with engagement, in combination with memory. So it's, if you will, it's a combination of a number of these different measures. They tend to form patterns. So we find that there are some where, say in the case of television viewing, you tend to see more higher engagement, higher levels of memory encoding, but lower levels of visual attention. And you get the flip side of that with, for example, aspects of internet. Different programs have different patterns. Drama will be different from certain informational programs. So in a sense, that's what we mean by neurostates. Different panelists came at the issue from their own particular perspective. The people who focus on autonomic interscope focus much more on measurement of sweating and changes in heart rate, etc., and more or less suggesting that's the way to the brain. It may be. We prefer to measure directly because we think that there are things that are just difficult to measure externally, such things as, for example, whether the left hemisphere memory process is more than the right. That means you're encoding information about detailed names, things like that. Right hemisphere, emotion, facial expression, things like that. I think that probably the issues that we probably agreed most on were that neuroscience has a significant part to play given the deficiencies of traditional research methodologies. Where I think we may have there been less agreement is well, it's difficult to say because, to be frank, the other presentations focus more on the methodology per se. In my case, what I tried to do was talk more about case studies. where you could actually demonstrate return on investment in a rather specific fashion rather than the science. That's not to say that we don't have a considerable body of science behind us and publications, and as I said, over the last 10 years, over 25,000 participant recordings, over 850 ads in our database, analysed ads, neuro-analysed ads with an average of 70 to 100 subjects per ad. So, as I said, there wasn't as much opportunity for robust discussion. I think we were probably all on our best behaviour, actually.
The big frontier is for advertisers. I guess our work, just to contextualise the response, our work falls broadly into two areas: the advertising and the creative optimisation. And then the other half would be all the media optimisation, and then we bring it together in that 360 approach where we can match that neuro state that Richard was talking about with media and message, and then it all comes together. But if we just handle them separately for a moment, the big frontier, or one of the big frontiers from a marketer's point of view that we would like to convey or certainly raise the consciousness of, and that is that small things really do make such a big difference. And sometimes those small things are partly intuitive. By some of the great creatives that we've worked with and have used neuro, it actually ends up supporting a lot of their recommendations, where a client comes in and sort of stomps over some subtle issue that the creative was looking to form in the first place. So, but broadly speaking, the fact that these subtleties can have a huge impact on advertising effectiveness and ROI, and there are and that also ties in with the philosophy that we take to clients, and that is that it's all in the timing, and that most things can work most of the time in a 30-second commercial or a 60-second brand builder, but what you find is that a traditional question and answer technique will talk to the creative as a whole, and it will ask about feelings as a whole, and that's fine, but the ad doesn't work as a whole all the time. Things are moving on around all the time and very, very rapidly, and it's capitalising on the important elements of the storytelling and actually leveraging branding and message off them at a specific point in time.
I think one of the things we aim at is, from the point of view of the customer, not to be neuroscientists. And what I mean by that is, we aim at having our findings understandable by people who are not neuroscientists. You don't need a neuroscientist talking over your shoulder and explaining what every single trace means. There are certain results that we present, memory encoding. These generally will be animated graphs, for example, during attention, but generally memory encoding, engagement, and it's pretty obvious what you want. High memory encoding, up it goes, means that that particular image, scene, fact is going well as a memory. That's what you're after. We can measure such things as whether you are attracted, you like what you're seeing, or repelled. In most cases, the creatives have a clear idea as to what they're trying to achieve with the ad. And so, in many ways, having explained to the client, what our approach is, what are the sort of results, what do they look like, then it comes down to the issue of the client sort of saying, well, here's my problem. I want to know what is the musical backing I should select. Do we have a problem with this particular campaign? How can we improve? Here is, for example, a near-finished campaign. How can we tweak things to optimize it to the maximum ability? We know what the criteria are. There are certain things that have to go into long-term memory. There are certain states of engagement. Maybe there are certain things you want to have the audience dislike, for example, to maybe stop them doing certain things, or so by understanding what the hypotheses and what the questions that the client's concerned about, we interpret that very simply in terms of, here are the things, the psychological state that you would like to see the audience experience when they're seeing your communication. And then it's a matter of, well, does it actually achieve what you want to achieve? We don't give scores 6.3 out of 10 to a map. What we do is we sort of say, this is what the creative is doing. If it's what you want it to be doing, that's effectiveness. If it's not, quite often the data will tell you the sorts of things that you need to do. But we don't want to be in a situation where our clients have to be brain scientists first before they can use the sort of findings that we have. We hope that they are, and they seem to be, intuitively understandable so that they can use them straight away. There are certain principles which we've seen. For example, one of the things that we've noticed is, given how important memory encoding, in other words, what goes into memory of branding and key message is, what we've found is that there are certain types of events, the way that the story is presented, which cause the brain to, if you will, briefly shut down, not shut down, but to reduce its intake of memory while it processes. We call this effect conceptual closure. So if I'm telling you a joke and I come to the punchline, bang, that will be encoded, but then immediately after it, the brain sort of takes, just for a second or two, a bit of a rest, not a rest so much, but it's busy. Close the door memory and it processes that information. It seems to store information in lumps, in quanta. And what we find is that quite often people have tended to put the branding at those key points where they think, oh, that's the punchline, that's where I should put the story. It's not. And that conceptual closure effect is not bad in itself. It simply says the brain is said, that was an entire event. I'm storing that as an event. Anything which suggests this is the end, and it could be, as I said, a punchline of a joke. It could be something visual, like a screen filling up with the colour. It could even be musical, something which sort of, or even something as symbolic as a handshake, as if to sort of say, that's the end of that, will trigger that effect. Many cases, you can't work out what's happening. The brain activity will tell you when it's happening. So that's probably one of the most intriguing sort of rules that we've found. Timing is really important. And in some cases, it's just a matter of shifting things just a few seconds. But more generally, is there a sort of a general set of rules which you can use to make great advertising? Well, there may be some general ones. I've mentioned one, for example. But in most cases, each ad is an individual narrative in its own right. It has its own internal structure and how things interact, and you really have to look at them as an individual case. Each story is individual. So one of the sort of golden rules is each story is individual.
Picking up on that comment that Richard was talking about earlier about conceptual closure, we've worked with clients where their commercials have been going to air for 3 months, for example, or 6 months. And when we've actually measured them, there are elements within those commercials that actually suffer heavily from conceptual closure. And what the fascinating thing is that through continuous tracking, even though we would prefer to use real consumer data, I guess continuous tracking is somewhere up the funnel as an interim measure, even on certain elements of, specific elements of message takeout within a 30-second commercial have actually aligned very, very closely with those elements and those specific areas of conceptual closure, where what was communicated during closure had significantly lower recall through tracking than other elements through the commercial, which were much, much higher on memory encoding. So yeah, it's good to see that coming out in the wash.